Now, Turkish police have used tear gas and water cannons to disperse crowds that gathered outside the headquarters of the opposition Zaman newspaper. The newspaper's social media accounts report that police were trying to forcefully take Zaman's chief editor out of the building. Authorities have reportedly blocked the office of the newspaper's editors, preventing them from entering. Crowds had gathered outside the building, protesting against the Turkish government's decision to take over the management of the media group. RT's Ilya Petrenko joined me earlier in the studio with more details from the protest in Turkey.
Well, it all began with the court's decision to essentially take over the management of the Zaman media group to some other people who, according to some reports, are closely affiliated with the government. And of course that caused a large outcry. Protesters started gathering outside the offices of the media group, but the protest was purely peaceful. They did not attack the police or block the roads, sometimes of course screaming out slogans. We've seen some Turkish flags there. According to reports, those people were mostly essentially readers of that newspaper. They wanted to protect the offices and not to allow the police raid the Zaman headquarters. But at some point, the situation turned much more tense. We saw water cannon vehicles arriving, and police started pushing protesters back away from the gate. There were minor scuffles, but when the authorities realized perhaps that there was very stiff resistance, they started pushing the crowds away with water cannons and also tear gas. And right after that, police entered the building, and that's where the dramatic scenes happened. This is not just an opposition newspaper, but it is one of the largest newspapers in Turkey. Zaman literally means time. It is 30 years old, and it had one of the widest circulations last year, reaching up to 1 million or even exceeding 1 million. It was one of the first Turkish newspapers to go online, so apparently very important, with a very high audience stretching across the country and also reaching out to other countries. It had circulations in 11 countries. Read out a bit of an update that was published on the English sister channel today, Zaman. They were saying that a lot of employees stayed inside the buildings trying to protect their premises. They shouted, "Free press cannot be silenced." And apparently the police also used tear gas inside, which makes it really difficult for the people, because when of course it is used in open air, that's a completely different thing, whereas inside much more brutal, I would say. We will have to wait and see what happens after today's raid. There was fierce resistance when it came to the police entering the building, so we'll still have to wait and see what happens with the people who are blocking the police from entering those offices. So we have some media outlets and news organizations in Turkey whose investigative journalists have been digging into stories that are linked to the Turkish government, to President Erdogan himself, sometimes his family. And there were accusations against these people, sometimes when it comes to their direct involvement, sometimes turning a blind eye on things like the oil smuggling from areas controlled by Islamic State in parts of Syria and also in parts of Iraq. Then in some cases allowing the flow of arms, in some cases heavy arms, into Syria, where apparently they fall into the hands of jihadists from organizations that are branded terrorists all over the world. ISIL, Jabhat, Nusra, and we cannot forget that there's been a major crackdown on the Kurdish population that is an ethnic minority in Turkey's southeast. But when we say minority, we have to understand that this is an enormously large ethnic group. The main chunk of that nationality stays in Turkey, and that's where they are under enormous pressure. And the journalists, the politicians, the authors the activists who have been speaking out against Ankara's treatment of these people, they come under fierce criticism by the Turkish government, sometimes direct threats, even direct threats from the government.
Turkey says the Zaman newspaper has been seized because of links to a cleric that Ankara claims heads a terror group. Fethullah Gulen is an influential critic of President Erdogan. He's currently in self-imposed exile in the U.S. Turkey accuses him of attempting to overthrow the government in 2013. Now, people who gathered to support the Zaman newspaper before they were dispersed by police say that no one in the newspaper is affiliated with terrorists.
What can I say? You see the scene here. There is terror everywhere in the country, but they come to take everything from these poor people. This cruelty can't continue much longer. There is nobody linked to terror here.
I'm here to support Zaman. They can see Zaman from our hands, but they cannot take it out from our hearts. They cannot quiet us.
The editors of the newspaper's editor-in-chief addressed the crowd earlier. This is what he had to say.
We would rather have invited you here in better times, but our country is being dragged down with more bad news every day. On the one hand, we have martyrs and displaced people. On the other, jailed journalists, academics fired from universities, TV stations closed down. We tried hard to bring you better news, but Turkey is deteriorating ever more. And we're in the middle of all this. It will be a stain on our democracy. But I assure you, and want you to believe, democracy will prevail. The free press will not be silenced.
4 years ago, then Prime Minister Erdogan was apparently a fan of the Zaman newspaper. Here's a picture of him congratulating the publication on its 25th birthday. In the meantime, new chiefs have been appointed to run the newspaper. One of them is an open supporter of President Erdogan and the ruling party, as can be seen from his Twitter account's background. We spoke with Zaman's foreign affairs correspondent about Friday's seizure.
Zaman and all its subsidiaries, including today's Zaman, would be taken over in a government-backed operation. 4 buses, 4 coaches full of anti-terror squads were being sent over to the Zaman headquarters in Istanbul, anti-riot police. So tomorrow's newspaper will probably be the last time it's been written how it's supposed to be written by the editorial team of today's Zaman. Erdogan's, he has no tolerance for any sort of dissension or any sort of opposition, whether it be in politics or whether it be in the media. They're trying to silence free media.
On Friday, RT's Gane Chichikan was at a U.S. State Department press briefing and was surprised with quite an unusual comment on the Turkish newspaper made by the State Department spokesperson. Take a listen.
The U.S. State Department disapproves of what Turkey does to its media. Usually when journalists, myself included, ask about Turkey, the State Department is very careful not to offend its ally too much, even in cases where Turkey's policies completely contradict U.S. stated policies. Washington can often be seen walking on eggshells when it comes to Turkey. But this time, the tone seemed different.
Can you condemn the Turkish court decision to replace the entire management and editorial board of Feze Media Group? One of its main publications, Zaman Daily, has been sharply critical of the Erdogan government, and they are now accused of helping terrorists. Can you condemn that decision?
We see this as the latest in a series of troubling judicial and law enforcement actions taken by the Turkish government, targeting media outlets and others critical of it. We call on the Turkish government to ensure full respect for due process and equal treatment under the law, court-ordered supervision of a media company's finances and operations should not prompt changes to the newsroom or editorial policy. I don't think that these sorts of actions are in keeping with the healthy democratic values that are enshrined again in Turkey's own constitution. We don't think that they're in keeping with that.
The State Department spokesperson still spoke about Turkey being an ally and a partner on a host of issues, but that partnership seems increasingly awkward considering some major differences that the countries have. And it's not just the way Turkey treats its media. Ankara accuses Washington of supporting terrorists, Syrian Kurds, that is, whom nobody but Turkey considers terrorists. The U.S. has tried to downplay the differences as much as it could, but Erdogan's government seems to be making it very difficult to do.
Well, human rights activist Jamu Baraka and Richard Becker say that America's stance on the matter is just as much of a concern as Ankara's crackdown on opposition media.
I think there needs to be a consistent, loud voice coming from the nations that pretend to be the upholders of democracy and human rights. That basically Turkey being a friend of the West, and the West that pretends to uphold democracy, those states should roundly condemn this latest incident. But the real troubling aspect of this is that Western nations have allowed Turkey, the Saudis, and for themselves to operate above international law. We see that even the U.S. government says that they are, quote unquote, troubled by what happened in Turkey.
When they call something troubling, that's the word, I think, the kind of key word in their statement, then you know that they're really just trying to kind of get over this point.
And as we've been saying, this is not the first media scandal in Turkey. On Thursday, the editor-in-chief and the Ankara bureau chief of Turkey's Cumhuriyet newspaper were released from prison after 3 months. They were charged with divulging state secrets, attempting to overthrow the government, and assisting a terrorist organization. That is after the newspaper claimed Turkey was involved in ISIS, oil, and weapons smuggling. Here's what the newspaper's editor-in-chief had to say after he was released.
It is not possible to achieve freedom without paying some price. We believe in the importance of being free by paying this price, and we hope that this international solidarity will continue hereafter. I would like to express that we will continue to struggle until Turkey has a free press and becomes a democratic state.
Sibel Güneş from the Turkish Journalists Association says opposition media is strictly restricted by the authorities.
The government has created a restrictive climate for opposition journalists wanting to report in the dangerous border regions. So instead, they often have to follow the reporting done by their foreign counterparts.